Ever noticed how some of the biggest names in history, empires that seemed untouchable, just vanished? We often think of epic battles, political backstabbing, or natural disasters as the culprits. But what if I told you that one of the deadliest empire killers is something we all deal with today? Debt. That's right. From ancient Rome to the mighty British Empire, a mountain of debt has toppled more thrones than any army. Let's start our journey in ancient Rome. At its peak, Rome was the center of the world. They built incredible aqueducts, roads that still exist today, and had a military that was the envy of everyone. But all this costs money. A lot of money. The Roman emperors loved to spend, not just on infrastructure and their legions, but on lavish lifestyles. Grandiose games to please the public, and massive welfare programs like the grain dole. To pay for it all, they did what many governments do. They borrowed and they taxed. But when tax revenues weren't enough, they got creative in a very destructive way. They started debasing their currency. Imagine you have a coin that's pure silver. The emperors would recall these coins, melt them down, mix in cheaper metals like copper, and then mint more coins from the same amount of silver. Suddenly they had more coins to spend. Problem solved, right? Not quite. People aren't stupid. They quickly realized the new coins contained less precious metal and were worth less. This led to rampant inflation. Prices for everyday goods like bread and oil skyrocketed. Imagine being a Roman soldier stationed on the frontier. Your pay is in these new debased coins. Suddenly your salary can't buy you what it used to. You become disgruntled. Your loyalty wavers. This is exactly what happened. The military's morale and effectiveness plummeted. At the same time, the rich, who held their wealth in land and assets, were largely unaffected. But the middle class and the poor, who relied on cash, were wiped out. The economic glue holding the empire together dissolved. This internal financial decay made Rome a hollow shell, vulnerable to external pressures from barbarian tribes. When they finally pushed, the rotten structure collapsed. Debt didn't just bankrupt the treasury, it eroded the very fabric of Roman society. Now let's fast forward a few centuries to the Spanish Empire in the 16th and 17th centuries. Spain hit the jackpot. They discovered vast amounts of gold and silver in the Americas. Shiploads of treasure poured into the country. You'd think this would make them the richest, most stable empire on earth forever. But here's the twist. This massive influx of wealth actually sowed the seeds of their downfall. It was like winning the lottery and going broke a few years later. The Spanish kings, particularly Philip II, were engaged in constant, expensive wars all over Europe. They were fighting to maintain their territories in the Netherlands, battling the Ottoman Empire in the Mediterranean, and trying to suppress Protestantism. These wars were a financial black hole. The treasure from the New World, as fast as it came in, went right back out to pay for soldiers, ships, and weapons. It wasn't invested in Spain's domestic economy, in agriculture or manufacturing. Instead, Spain became dependent on importing goods from other countries, paid for with their silver. When the flow of treasure wasn't enough to cover their military spending, the Spanish crown did what Rome did. They borrowed. They took massive loans from Genoese and German bankers, using future silver shipments as collateral. At one point, future revenues were mortgaged for years in advance. This led to a series of state bankruptcies. Imagine a country just declaring, "Sorry, we can't pay our debts." This shattered their credit, made it harder and more expensive to borrow in the future, and caused financial chaos. The endless wars funded by debt and foreign silver crippled Spain's economy, leading to a long, slow decline from which they never fully recovered. The treasure that was meant to be their greatest strength became their ultimate weakness. Let's move on to another fascinating case, the Ottoman Empire. For over 600 years, the Ottomans were a dominant force, stretching from Southeast Europe to North Africa and the Middle East. In their golden age under rulers like Suleiman the Magnificent, their administration was efficient and their military was feared. But by the 19th century, things had changed dramatically. The empire was known as the sick man of Europe, and a primary cause of this sickness was, you guessed it, debt. The Ottomans were trying to modernize. They saw the industrial and military advancements in Western Europe and knew they had to keep up. They wanted to build railways, modernize their army, and reform their bureaucracy. But these reforms were incredibly expensive and the traditional Ottoman tax system was outdated and inefficient. So where did they turn for cash? To European banks? Starting in the 1850s, the Ottoman government began taking on huge loans from British and French financiers. At first, the money seemed like a miracle, fueling modernization projects. But the interest rates were high, and the empire's ability to generate revenue didn't grow as fast as its debt. They fell into a classic debt trap. They had to take out new loans just to pay the interest on the old ones. The situation got so bad that in 1881, the empire was forced to accept the creation of the Ottoman Public Debt Administration. This wasn't just an internal department. It was an organization controlled by foreign European creditors. These foreigners were put in charge of collecting key Ottoman taxes from things like salt, silk, and stamps to ensure the European banks got their money back. Essentially, the Ottoman Empire had lost control of its own finances. It lost their economic sovereignty. This massive debt not only drained the treasury, but also deeply humiliated the empire, fueling resentment and internal instability. When World War I broke out, the economically hollowed out and politically fragile empire was in no condition to survive the shock. The sick man finally succumbed to its long-term financial illness. Finally, let's look at an empire on which the sun, famously, never set: the British Empire. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, Britain was the world's superpower. Its navy ruled the waves, and its colonies spanned the globe. Its financial heart, the City of London, was the center of global capitalism. But 2 world wars in the 20th century changed everything. Winning a modern industrial war is astronomically expensive. Britain poured its national wealth into fighting World War I. They sold off overseas investments and took on enormous debts, primarily from the United States. By the end of the war, they had gone from being the world's biggest creditor to one of its biggest debtors.
Wow.
They managed to struggle through the 1920s and 30s, but then came World War II. This second conflict was the final fatal blow to Britain's imperial finances. The country liquidated almost all of its remaining overseas assets to pay for the war effort. They relied heavily on the Lend-Lease program from the US, which was essentially a giant line of credit. By 1945, Britain was victorious, but utterly bankrupt. The country was buried under a mountain of debt, again, mostly to the United States. Empire costs money to maintain. You need a massive navy and you need troops stationed around the world. But a bankrupt Britain could no longer afford this. They simply didn't have the cash to police their vast empire. This financial reality, combined with rising nationalist movements in colonies like India, made the end of the empire inevitable. The decision to grant India independence in 1947 was not just a political one, it was an economic one. Britain couldn't afford to hold on. Over the next 2 decades, the empire was dismantled piece by piece as Britain was forced to retreat and focus on rebuilding its shattered domestic economy. The cost of fighting and winning 2 world wars, funded by debt, had bankrupted the greatest empire the world had ever seen. So, from the debased coins of Rome to Britain's war loans, a clear pattern emerges. Empires don't just fall to invading armies, they rot from the inside out when their finances collapse. Uncontrolled spending, endless wars, and the crippling burden of debt create a weakness that can bring even the mightiest powers to their knees. It's a powerful lesson from history, reminding us that economic strength is the true foundation of any lasting power. Thanks for watching. If you found this journey through history interesting, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more stories about the hidden forces that shape our world. See you next time.